It's the summer of 1944. The war in Europe is grinding towards its conclusion, but in the Pacific, the Empire of Japan is still fiercely defiant. From air bases in China and later the Marianas, the United States Army Air Forces unleashes its ultimate weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It's not just a plane, it's a flying fortress, pressurized with remote-controlled gun turrets and capable of carrying a devastating bomb load over immense distances. The B-29 is a generation ahead of anything else in the sky. It is America's technological crown jewel, a symbol of its industrial might, and it's strictly forbidden from falling into foreign hands. Now, shift to August 20, 1944. A formation of B-29s returns to its base in China after a brutal raid on the steelworks in Anshan, Japanese-occupied Manchuria. One of them, Ramp Tramp, serial number 42-6256, is in trouble. Flak has crippled an engine and fuel is bleeding away. The pilot, Captain Howard R. Jarrell, faces an impossible choice: crash in enemy territory or seek sanctuary in a supposedly neutral country. He points the wounded giant towards the Soviet Union. The Soviets and Japanese are bound by a neutrality pact, and the USSR is still focused on the war against Germany. Officially, they are America's ally, but as Ramp Tramp skids to a halt on a makeshift airfield near Vladivostok, the crew's relief is short-lived. They are not greeted as allies. They are disarmed, detained, and isolated. The plane is impounded. Under the international laws of neutrality, the Soviets are required to intern the bomber and its crew for the duration of the conflict. But for Joseph Stalin, this was not an inconvenience. It was a gift from heaven. Stalin had been begging the Americans for B-29s through the Lend-Lease program for years. His requests were consistently denied. Washington understood the strategic advantage the B-29 represented and had no intention of sharing it. Now Stalin had one delivered right to his doorstep. He immediately gave a secret order. The Americans would be given the bare minimum of hospitality, but the aircraft would never leave. This was the first act in a grand, state-sponsored heist. The Ramp Tramp was the first, but it wouldn't be the last. 3 more B-29s would make emergency landings in Siberia over the coming months. The Soviets now had not 1, but 4 pristine examples of America's most advanced technology. The stage was set for one of the most ambitious reverse engineering projects ever conceived.
In Moscow, the order came down from the very top. Stalin summoned Andrei Tupolev, one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant, albeit recently imprisoned, aircraft designers. Tupolev, who had been working in a Sharashka, a secret prison laboratory for intellectuals, was given a task that bordered on the impossible. He was to take the 4 captured B-29s, disassemble them completely, and create a perfect, flyable Soviet copy. And he was to do it in an unimaginably short time frame. The project was given the highest state priority, codenamed B-4 or simply Article R. The directive from Stalin and the State Defense Committee was chillingly simple and absolute. The Soviet bomber must be an exact copy, not inspired by, not based on, but a perfect one-to-one replica. Every component, every wire, every rivet was to be duplicated with absolute precision. Why such a rigid command? The Soviets understood that the B-29 was a complex, integrated system. Changing even a small, seemingly insignificant part could have unforeseen consequences on the aircraft's performance, stability, and structural integrity. They didn't have the time or the foundational knowledge to re-engineer it. They had to clone it. The task was Herculean. The B-29 contained over 105,000 individual parts, 40,000 different types of rivets alone, and miles of electrical wiring. The Americans used the imperial measurement system, inches and feet. The Soviets used the metric system. Tupolev's team couldn't simply convert the blueprints. They had to re-engineer every single dimension and then create entirely new metric tooling, jigs, and manufacturing processes to produce them. This meant recalculating stress loads, material strengths, and tolerances for every part. The 4 B-29s were moved to a secret hangar at the Central Aerodrome in Moscow. One was chosen as the master template and meticulously disassembled. The second was used for static and fatigue testing. The third was kept as a reference, and the fourth was used for training and electrical systems analysis. Teams of thousands of engineers, draftsmen, and technicians worked around the clock in shifts. The hangar became a buzzing hive of clandestine activity, a temple of technological worship dedicated to an American idol. The pressure was immense. Failure was not an option in Stalin's Russia. For Tupolev and his team, success meant redemption. Failure could mean a return to the Gulag, or worse. The sheer scale of the conversion from imperial to metric became the project's first and most daunting wall. It wasn't just a mathematical exercise, it was a fundamental recreation of American industrial culture. Soviet engineers would measure a part and find its dimension was, for example, 1.137 inches. They couldn't just produce a 2.888 centimeter part. They had to understand why it was 1.137 inches. Was it for strength, for weight, for compatibility with another system? This led to countless headaches. Aluminum alloy sheets on the B-29 had specific thicknesses and tempers that the Soviet industry could not replicate. They had to develop entirely new metallurgical processes to create an equivalent, which they designated as B-29 grade aluminum. The tires were a different size and compound than any Soviet tire. New rubber factories had to be retooled. Then there were the rivets. The 40,000 different types were a nightmare. Each had to be measured, cataloged, and its purpose understood. Soviet draftsmen working in metric produced over 40,000 new drawings for the parts alone, and another 20,000 for the assembly jigs. The paperwork was staggering. One of the most famous anecdotes from the project involves a simple oversight. The Soviet engineers, following the copy exactly order to the letter, discovered a small, unexplained hole on the underside of the B-29's wing. They couldn't find any functional purpose for it. It wasn't for wiring, fuel, or control cables. Puzzled, they replicated it perfectly on their 2-4 prototype. Years later, they learned the truth. It was a drill hole made by a Boeing worker who had made a mistake on the original aircraft and simply patched it from the inside. The Soviets had copied an American manufacturing error with painstaking accuracy. This story, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly illustrates the philosophical core of the 2-4 project. It was not about innovation, it was about replication. It was a brute force assault on a technology gap, using sheer will and manpower to bypass a decade of research and development. The Soviet engineers weren't just building a plane, they were performing the world's most complex autopsy on a still-living technological specimen. Copying the airframe was one thing. Replicating the B-29's sophisticated internal systems was another challenge entirely, one that pushed Soviet electronics and avionics to their absolute limits. The Superfortress was a flying computer for its time, packed with technologies the Soviets had never seen. Start with the most obvious advantage, the pressurized cabin. This allowed the crew to fly comfortably at high altitudes, above most flak and enemy fighters. The Soviet aviation industry had no experience with large volume pressurization systems. Tupolev's team had to not only copy the complex ducting and seals, but also develop the testing protocols to ensure they wouldn't fail catastrophically at 30,000 feet. Then came the Central Fire Control System. This was the B-29's secret weapon. Instead of having gunners manually aiming their weapons and freezing open turrets, the B-29's 5 turrets were remotely controlled by gunners sitting in warm, pressurized plexiglass blisters. They used sophisticated analog computers to automatically calculate lead and trajectory, making the defensive fire incredibly accurate. For the Soviets, this was black magic. They had no equivalent technology. Reverse engineering the delicate servos, relays, and computers of the CFC system was arguably their single greatest achievement in the entire project. They succeeded, creating a system so identical that it was reportedly interoperable with the American original. The Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines were another monumental hurdle.
These 18-cylinder radial engines were powerful but notoriously temperamental, prone to overheating and engine fires. Soviet engine factories, like the one run by a young Sergei Ilyushin, had to deconstruct these mechanical marvels and learn to build them from scratch. They had to replicate precision-machined crankshafts, complex superchargers, and specialized carburetors. The Soviet copy, the Shvetsov Ash 73TK, would power the T-4, and, though similar, never quite matched the reliability of its American cousin, a testament to the subtle nuances of manufacturing expertise that are harder to copy than dimensions on a blueprint. After 2 years of breakneck, round-the-clock work, the moment of truth arrived. In May 1947, the first Soviet copy, now designated the Tupolev Tu-4, was rolled out of the hangar. To the untrained eye, it was a B-29. The lines, the proportions, the silhouette, everything was identical. But for Tupolev and his team, it was a vessel containing 2 years of their lives, their intellect, and their fear. The first flight was assigned to a celebrated Soviet test pilot, Nikolai Rybko. The tension at the airfield was palpable. Had they missed something? Was a miscalculated metric conversion about to cause a structural failure? As the 4 cloned ASH-73TK engines roared to life, the entire project hung in the balance. The plane taxied, gathered speed, and then, gracefully, its wheels left the ground. It flew, and it flew perfectly. The success was a monumental propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. When the Tu-4 was publicly unveiled at the 1947 Tushino Air Show, it sent shockwaves through the Western diplomatic and military attachés in attendance. They looked up, first with recognition, then with disbelief. The United States believed it held a monopoly on strategic bombing. In an instant, that monopoly had vanished. The appearance of the Tu-4 was Stalin's blunt message to the world. The Soviet Union was now a peer superpower, capable of projecting power globally. It could now deliver its own atomic bomb, which it would test in 1949, directly to the heart of the United States' allies and potentially, one day, to the American mainland itself. The Cold War balance of power had just dramatically shifted.
The debut of the Tu-4 fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Cold War. Almost overnight, the United States lost its sense of invulnerability. The B-29 had been the backbone of the planned Strategic Air Command that would deter or wage war against the USSR. Now, the Soviets had the same weapon. Cities in Western Europe and even bases in Alaska and the Pacific were now within range of a Soviet nuclear strike. This triggered a massive response from the United States. It accelerated the development of its next-generation strategic bomber, the jet-powered B-47 Stratojet, and poured resources into air defense systems, such as the D-1 line, distant early warning, across the Arctic. The Tu-4 had effectively kick-started the next phase of the arms race. It was no longer a question of if the Soviets could build a long-range bomber, but how many they would build and how soon they would build them. The Tu-4 itself never dropped a bomb in anger, but it was a potent symbol and a crucial stepping stone. It gave the Soviet aviation industry a masterclass in American large aircraft design and manufacturing techniques. The knowledge gained from reverse engineering the B-29 was directly applied to the next generation of Soviet bombers and transports, including the iconic Tupolev T-95 Bear, which still serves today, and whose basic design lineage can be traced back to that Siberian field. Furthermore, the Tu-4 was instrumental in the early Soviet nuclear program. It was used to drop the first Soviet atomic bomb in a test in 1951. It also became the platform for the USSR's first strategic airborne early warning aircraft. The 3 original B-29s that landed in Siberia had, through their Soviet doppelgangers, spawned an entire family of aircraft that would menace the West for decades.
the theft had paid off in ways even Stalin might not have imagined.
While Soviet engineers were performing technological alchemy, the American crews of the interned B-29s were living a bizarre and frustrating diplomatic limbo. They were not prisoners of war, but they were not free. They were housed in a compound and subjected to constant, low-level interrogation by the NKVD, who were desperate for any operational details about the B-29. The Soviets staged a dramatic escape for the crews months later, transporting them to the border of Iran, which was under Allied control. It was all a carefully orchestrated charade to maintain the facade of neutrality with Japan. The crews returned home as heroes, but they were also debriefed by American intelligence, who were desperate to learn anything about the fate of their secret weapon. The men of the Ramp Tramp and the other B-29s had no idea that their aircraft had become the most important state secret in the Soviet Union. The ultimate historical irony came years later, during the height of the Cold War, as both the US and USSR developed more advanced aircraft. The Tu-4 and the B-29, once mortal enemies, found themselves operating in close proximity. There are accounts of American and Soviet pilots flying the genetically identical aircraft, recognizing each other's planes during reconnaissance or intercept missions. They were flying mirror images, one born from a Boeing factory, the other from a Siberian act of desperation and theft. It was a perfect flying metaphor for the Cold War itself. Two superpowers, ideologically opposed, yet locked in a strange mirrored dance of mutual assured destruction. A dance that began with 4 unexpected landings in the Far East.
The story of the Tu-4 is more than a tale of espionage. It is a case study in how technology, politics, and sheer human determination collide. It demonstrated that in the modern era, a technological gap could be closed not only by innovation, but also by appropriation. The Soviets saved themselves perhaps a decade of development and an incalculable amount of money. The legacy of the Tu-4 is twofold. On one hand, it was a stunning success. It provided the USSR with an immediate strategic bomber force, catalyzed its aviation industry, and served as a reliable platform for years. It forced the West to take Soviet technological capabilities seriously from that point forward. On the other hand, it also revealed a fundamental weakness. The copy exactly mandate, while effective in the short term, may have stifled a certain degree of indigenous creativity. It ingrained a culture of replication that, some argue, put Soviet design bureaus in a catch-up mode for years to come. While they became masters of reverse engineering, the true, groundbreaking innovations in jet engines, swept-wing design, and avionics often continued to originate in the West, forcing the Soviets to, yet again, play a game of technological catch-up. Today, the last remaining B-29s are museum pieces, revered relics of a world war. The Tu-4s are mostly gone, scrapped or left to rot. But their story is a permanent fixture in the history of the 20th century. It's a story that began with a damaged bomber seeking refuge and ended with the world being split into 2 armed camps, each holding a version of the same weapon. The Tu-4 Bull was the ghost of the B-29, a phantom that haunted the early Cold War and proved that in the shadowy struggle between superpowers, the most valuable spy isn't always a person. Sometimes it's 65 tons of aluminum and ingenuity left stranded on a Siberian field.